Good evening, and I want to welcome you back to this spring 2019 edition of the College Democrats versus College Republicans political debate. We have three new panelists here discussing U.S. foreign policy and U.S. intervention. I'm now going to toss it to the College Democrats for their opening statements.
Hi, I'm Michael Goldsmith.
I'm Jake Burdett.
I'm Emma Shankman. The United States has a history of direct intervention in non-democratic governments, especially in Africa and the Middle East. And quite frankly, what we've done in the rest of the world is dangerous. We have created regime changes where we have given power to dictators and religious extremists because they promised us more money, more power, more whatever, depending on the particular situation. We believe that the best way to handle our foreign policy is to respect the will of the people in these countries and respect their right to their own government.
Thank you. I'm now going to toss it to the College Republicans for them to introduce themselves and their opening statements.
Hi, I'm Daniel.
I'm Shea.
And I'm Bradley. So not to take away from the policies of Delano Roosevelt, not to take away from Bill Clinton, and not to take away from the entire Vietnam War. Those are all generally colossal failures in every respect of proper military doctrine. Those are also all Democratic policy ran campaigns. As a conservative, realistically, there should be really 5 criteria that should justify military intervention in any conflict. It should only be implemented as a last resort to defend our national security interests. Intervention should not jeopardize the ability of the United States to respond to 2 separate fronts at any time. Having all of our military might focused in Vietnam, focused in Europe, focused in Africa is ludicrous in any form, and with that we cannot respond to other security commitments to ourselves and our allies. The third condition is it should strive to achieve military goals that are defined, that are achievable, decisive, and that the victory is sustainable. The intervention should enjoy congressional and public support. The pattern since the Second World War has been presidential doctrine for combat, both the Republican and Democrat side, which kind of, defeats the entire purpose of having the congressional approval for any military conflict. Fifth criteria, which is, I believe, the most important, the armed forces should be given the ability to create the conditions necessary for success. They should never be placed in a position where they are not in control of what they do. Peacekeeping operations in the traditional sense generally fail because they are permitted only to do when fired upon. They cannot successfully complete their mission with the restrictions that have been placed on them as current military policies is dictated.
Thank you. I'm now going to toss to the College Democrats, and my question to you guys is, what issue that's on the global main stage do you guys find most important, and what kinds of solutions do you feel that would be most effective for the United States?
Obviously, the most important thing that the United States is currently involved in is the war on terror. That's what we've been involved in since 2001 after 9/11. And one of the major things that I think leads to why this is such a big issue is that the United States supports 73% of the world's dictatorships. One of those dictatorships, Saudi Arabia, is very known for funding and propping up jihadists, Wahhabists, Salafists ideologies, and that leads to groups such as Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, and the groups that we have been fighting for the past 18 years. I've already forgotten. I don't think there's been a day in my life when there's not been a war. So obviously that's really big to me.
So I understand that there are these issues, and we know we have this relationship with Saudi Arabia, but these extremist groups still exist. So what is our solution? Is there a solution to do nothing?
The 73% of dictatorships that we fund, majority of them fund those, so we stop funding those. They don't have nearly as many resources to give to them. And we basically hold our allies accountable to these types of incidents that have caused massive terrorist attacks, and we work from there.
A really simple way to put it is that it's a cycle. So you have, these groups that we prop up because they will promise us oil and other necessary supplies. But you have to remember that these countries, these regimes aren't necessarily pro-American. They're pro-American money. And so what they're going to do is, once they have our support and once they are propped up in their own country, then they are going to fund anti-American terror anyway. They don't care that we prop them up. That's irrelevant. So if we let go of some of our big stick diplomacy a little bit and say, you know what? We need to trust the people in these countries, treat them as actual people, and say, you know what, you have a right to your own country. Then you know what happens 99% of the time? They're democratically led.
So now I want to toss it to the Republicans. What in their solution did you see as possible flaws, and what would you pose as your own solution?
Well, I think the first thing is that it's not necessary that they're going, or it's not an inevitability that they're going to be democratically led. You look at a situation like Saudi Arabia, as they mentioned, they had a king before we got there. It's been one monarchy after another. There's just areas in the world, a lot of the areas where you don't have democracy as a setup. People have been in one form of war, or they've been in one form of dictatorship probably for all of history. We have to work around that. We have to find things that we can do to work with these people to stop terrorists, because the MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, he's not a terrorist. He doesn't want terrorists to destabilize him, because that's kind of their goal, destabilization in a lot of cases. He wants to have a stable government, and it's not a government where it'll be all nice, right? We wouldn't want to live there, but at the end of the day, we're not living there. It's their world. It's how they're going to have it, and we have to kind of deal with it in that case. As far as dealing with state-sponsored terrorism, as we talked about, I think that the U.S. needs to intervene in those cases. You look at some situations in the past. You had the Belfast bombings, the Lockerbie bombings, where a bunch of terrorists blew up a plane. They were funded by Gaddafi. We bombed Gaddafi. You look at a situation like Hezbollah, like Hamas. They're funded by Iran. We try to fight Iran. We do what we can, but we need to make sure that we're working within the bounds of reality.
If I may, one of the problems with the war on terror is it's unlike what we commonly associate with a war. We are not engaged with a state or a visible enemy. We're at war with a violent ideology, individuals that exist within a state but do not share a uniform or any sort of defining features until you're being fired upon. And that's one of the main issues that's really made the war on terror so difficult to fight. And I also agree, we need to go after those who are directly funding these terrorist organizations, and if we want to stop these movements from growing.
And just this past week, we've moved a carrier strike force into the Persian Gulf, directly to counter the Hamas and Hezbollah attacks on Israel again. Iran is the largest state sponsor of terror, and the weapons that get into the Gaza Strip come through tunnels from Egypt. Putting a carrier strike force in the Persian Gulf is the United States' response to that. A U.S. terror task force is the most powerful conventional weapon in the world, throughout all of world history, to be honest. There's nothing that it cannot do with a Marine Expeditionary Unit attached. That is the most that we can do without engaging in actual armed conflict with the state supporters of this terrorism.
Well, do you think that's like the only reason why we would ever intervene in another country is purely for these very idealistic reasons?
No. There's lots of reasons. Look at a situation like Rwanda. We didn't intervene, and people died. Look at a situation like Bosnia, Herzegovina. We didn't intervene, people died. People lived once we started intervening, once we put a no-fly zone, once we started an operation there. There's reasons aside from just fighting terrorism. There's reasons because we're trying to help people. We're trying to make the world a more stable place. And these are things that benefit not only us, not only the people living there, they benefit everyone in the world.
I would like to counter the point on Iran being the largest state sponsor of terrorism. That's constantly used. However, it's still debated. It could be Iran or it could be Saudi Arabia. One is our ally, one is our enemy. We typically use Iran because they're our enemy. However, that's not necessarily the truth in if they are actually the largest sponsor of state terrorism. However, You also mentioned before that we had major flaws in going to wars in places like Vietnam and Korea. One of the reasons why we lost in Vietnam and why we continue to have a war in Korea is because we are not fighting, as you say, countries that have a banner of any sort. We are fighting people that are guerrilla fighters, very similar to our war on terror. If we want to learn from our history, then I believe that we should. The reason why we lost Vietnam was because it was a guerrilla war. Currently, the reason why we have not won the war on terror is because it is a guerrilla war. If you think that intervention within those countries and sending people to those countries again is going to lead to some sort of magical victory scenario, it's not going to happen. It's going to be a never-ending war. And I don't think that that's where we want our soldiers. I think that our soldiers should be back at home protecting us from real threats that happen on our soil and not in some foreign land.
So, you know, one of the big reasons that 9/11 happened, that bin Laden was so adamant in attacking Americans prior to 9/11, he was talking about American bases in Saudi Arabia. It was, he didn't want us there. He wanted it weaker. His whole thing was basically what ISIS was trying to take. ISIS being an offshoot of them eventually. A whole bunch of stuff happened in the medium, but there's the same sort of goal, to create a caliphate, to create a Islamic fundamentalist Holy Land, you know, Sharia, a whole 9 yards, all that stuff in that area. And he couldn't do that with the U.S. there. The fact is, whether we're there or not, he was going to be doing this attack. He was going to be fighting his war. And rather, if we fight them there, they don't fight us here. We didn't fight them there, and then they came here, 9/11.
Well, what was the reason for why he was able to do anything like in trying to establish a caliphate, though?
Because he was a rich boy.
We assisted him against the USSR. We assisted the Taliban. We had bin Laden in the White House, and that's currently what we're doing with Saudi Arabia. We are propping up Saudi Arabia. We're allowing them to have funds that then give to Salafists, Wahhabists, jihadists, and those people end up creating the ISIS, the Al-Qaedas, the Al-Nusras, the Hezbollahs, all those groups. We cannot continue to say that that is our, you know, end goal while doing the things that are contradictory to that.
Americans have this view of
Allow him to speak.
You started with the question, and I wanted to give him a chance to respond
Yes,
to that
of course.
question.
Could you repeat the question, please?
What was the question that I started, if you remember?
Was there a question?
It was
Because
something
you
along the
had
lines.
began to speak immediately after
Right.
he had said his question, and then he continued. So
I
I
didn't mean to try and cut you off.
No, that's quite all right. It was something along the lines, likely, of if this is how we plan to succeed by defeating these groups, why are we doing things that are counter to that?
Good question. That's a good question. Personally, I don't think we should be giving out foreign aid in the way that we do. I think that there's economic reasons we do it in terms of propping up certain companies, propping up jobs. It's one congressman's district in the middle of somewhere means he's going to vote in that way. And that's probably not the best thing, but that's the system we live in. And I really don't think there's any way you can change that aside from shutting all the factories down. It's partly because we have this long history of, like 40, 50, 60 odd years now, ever since the whole Berlin Wall went up, that we've been building these alliances, we've been creating these webs. And at the end of the day, you reap what you sow. Maybe we could get rid of all foreign aid. Maybe we couldn't. I think that there's going to be a lot more trouble to it than just getting rid of it. A lot of people are going to be upset. And honestly, at the end of the day, I'm a good old-fashioned just bomb the guys.
I wanna ask the college Democrats a question here. So, what do you feel the responsibility is of the United States in handling foreign affairs on a global level? To sum it up, basically, at what point do you feel it is the responsibility of the United States to intervene? Whether it be, the point in time in World War II when Hitler almost ran the world, had the United States not intervened then? So my question is, at what point do you say, now's the time we got to get in there?
Americans have this very warped view, I think, sometimes of the rest of the world being somehow behind us, and I don't think that's true. I think that the rest of the world is right with us. I think just because you're not, white and American doesn't mean your country is behind. I think that what we do is American civilians get that feeling because we prop up backwards regimes in other countries. Like before the Islamic theocracy in Iran, there was a secular democracy. in the 1960s, and there, women could dress however they want. They could act however they want. The problem is not foreign cultures. It's not the foreign world. It's the groups that we prop up there.
Yeah, if you'd like to go on that.
So I'm noticing there's a lot of textbooks. You guys have done your research. I did my research, but you're not offering any solutions. Your solution is stop funding state sponsors of terrorism. That's wonderful. That's great. I think we should do it. But the American presence on the global stage is a lot more than just stopping terrorism. It's a very large part of our job, but realistically, American military intervention stems to protecting international trade routes. We have the largest Navy the world has ever seen, probably will ever see. Our job with that Navy is not to go pillage a ship, go kill terrorists, or go kill states. Our primary job is to protect the interests of the American economy, the American people, and the global market. Actually, most of our military involvement is actually not combat roles. We provide escort through dangerous stretches, through the Persian Gulf, through the Horn of Africa, which, due to American intervention, the piracy off of the Horn of Africa has all but stopped. American efforts in the Far East have also curbed piracy there. Actually, have you heard of Operation Tamagotchi?
I've heard of it. I don't know much about it. Would you please explain?
After the tsunamis and earthquakes in Japan, roughly, I want to say 3 years ago, the United States has bases forward deployed there. We have the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit. We have a Navy base. We have several Navy bases, actually. We were the first boots on the ground besides the Japanese Self-Defense Force. We are everywhere in the world to do good and to advance our own national interests. In this case, our job with the Navy, Marines, Air Force, Army, in humanitarian, am I out of time?
Keep going.
In humanitarian capacity, our vast Navy, our vast military force allows us to be anywhere we need to be and to provide the military and humanitarian aid that the world needs in times of crisis.
Okay, you say you would like policies. We've given one, which is to stop funding state-sponsored terrorism. That's a good one. How about we stop doing shadow war in Africa? That's another really good one. We're currently bombing about 8 different countries that I know of. We have military bases and operations that are military in nature in about 40 different African countries. We need to stop doing that. We need to stop bombing those 8 countries as well. Another thing that we can do is, I agree that we are very useful in providing humanitarian aid, and I think that having our bases is good. I personally would not like to be in those areas, but we are in a global world. We kind of have to be in those areas. However, instead of giving people bullets to their face, we give them food to assist them. I definitely agree that that's one other policy that we could work more with the international community on. Currently, we're not doing that. The UN has asked us to stop sponsoring these areas, such as Saudi Arabia. We instead put them on the Human Rights Council of the UN. It's not very useful to say, okay, well, this is what we're going to do in the world, and then not actually do it. Instead, say, okay, we're going to go to wars with these people. We're going to bomb these people. We're going to, allow Saudi Arabia to intervene in the Yemeni civil war, and that has led to starvation of millions. We can't do those things and then say we're also going to be for humanitarian aid.
I think that the idea that the United States is Superman is a little overly idealistic. I think that in an ultimate world, the world you describe would be identical to the truth, that we go in and we try to do good. But I think that that it's possible that there is some more nefarious purposes for going into these countries than just to save lives. I think that it's more than that. I think that we have economic and geopolitical reasons for going over there, and we kill civilians for oil, for whatever other natural resources they have over there, especially oil. We go over there and kill people for it, and I think that it's not fair to the people that have died just to say that we're over there to save them.
Well, of course we have economic interests. A lot of times our economic interest is stability. When it comes down to it, the world is not as nice and happy a place as I think anyone would wish it would be, or as most people believe it is. You look at a situation like you're talking about in Africa. Okay, let's say we stop the operations in Africa. We pull out. We just let Boko Haram go and kidnap people.
First off, that's not what I said.
No. You said 8 countries, shadow war.
I said 40 different countries that were having shadow war, 8 different bombings. I said stop doing military operations. We can still have the bases because I
So
don't like the bases.
We
I think
keep
should
the
have-
bases. We stop the operations. So we can see the terrorist group. We can see the rebel group outside committing the atrocity, but we can't go drop a bomb on them.
I think it's a false premise that it has to be the U.S. or any one country who acts as the world police. I'm glad you brought up, what would have happened with Hitler if the U.S. or some other country didn't step up to stop them. And that was a good point to make at the time. So the international community said, you know what, we should have this international body to intervene in situations like this where there are massive humanitarian crises, and that's how the United Nations got created. So I think if you leave it up to one country, because they have these economic interests, because they have these biases, even if they try to go in with good intentions, they're always going to have these conflicting interests affecting their actions, and that's why you have to leave it to a more impartial global body made up of all the countries rather than just one country who probably has a particular leaning one way or the other.
Well, we have had the UN go in situations. You look at something like Rwanda, they went in, didn't end very well. You look at a situation like Iraq with oil for food, didn't end very well. Fact is, when you leave it up to a large coalition of a lot of countries, they might send in people who are maybe not the most well-equipped. They'll send them in from countries that just don't have that great of a military of their own. The fact is that there's a certain point where the U.S. can do things other countries can't. You say we're not Superman. I know we're not Superman. But we have a lot more capability than anywhere else in the world, and we need to use it sometimes. You need to use it in Kosovo. You need to use it.
No, you're.
I just, I know this conversation's getting very hot. I think we both see firmly where each side is. So rather than harp on the topic too much longer, I want to toss it for their final statements. I give it to the Democrats.
Jay, would you like to do?
Yeah. So I think even if there are legitimate problems that exist in the world today, many of them can be traced back to the U.S. or Western European powers causing those issues in the first place. So, for example, with Africa, it was the Berlin Conference where they just divided Africa up randomly into different countries without taking into account the different ethnic groups and nationalities that already lived there. So you just lumped up these conflicting groups together into one country, and then we're surprised that, oh, wow, they didn't get along. Of course they're not going to get along. A lot of examples they pointed to why we need to go in there. Iran, because they're the number one state sponsor of terrorism. To reiterate Emma's point, Iran in the 60s had a secular liberal democracy with an elected democratic socialist leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, and then as soon as Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the oil to give the wealth back to the people, not U.S. corporations, the United States went in there, toppled a democratically elected leader, and put in an authoritarian Shah, which then led to the Ayatollah Khomeini taking power. So if we didn't cause this destabilization in the first place, there wouldn't be a power vacuum for radical groups to take over, which then leads to terrorism flourishing. We saw the same thing if we had never armed Osama bin Laden, the Mujahideen, they wouldn't have become Al-Qaeda and then done 9/11.
Thank you. I'm now going to give it to the college Republicans for their closing statements.
As always, hindsight's 20/20. I still haven't heard a clear solution. I'm going to go use my hindsight now. Gulf War 1, 1991. George Bush technically invades Kuwait in response to an Iraqi invasion of Kuwait with a coalition of countless other nations. The war's over in a matter of days or weeks, and it works because they followed some very clear protocols. The goals of the war were clearly defined. We were not there as conquerors, we were there as liberators. We were going to get Hussein out of Kuwait and then stop. If he had used chemical weapons against the coalition forces, it would have continued. He didn't, so there's no reason to continue and prolong an unwinnable war in the region. Our national and international support was met. The people in the United States and across the entire globe supported intervention in Kuwait. Finally, after the objectives were met, we stopped. That is the biggest overreach in American policy, is we continue to extend ourselves beyond what we're capable of after the goals have been met. That is the end of the story there. We need to go into conflict, achieve exactly what we mean to achieve, and then we need to let the people sort it out for themselves with support on a diplomatic scale rather than military.
All right, I want to thank you guys for joining us in this college debate between the college Republicans and the college Democrats. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.